All right, well, here we go. Hello, Professor Milich and fellow historians. My name is Adriana Basurto, and I represent Southern New Hampshire University, History 605, Cold War and American Empire. And for my final presentation and historiographic essay, I present the militarization of American foreign policy, long-term repercussions of Cold War defense strategies. Influenced by shifting American Soviet dynamics. American defense strategies alternated between direct confrontation and cautious engagement during the Cold War. The militarization of American foreign policy during the Cold War era, 1945 to 1991, led to long-term repercussions of Cold War defense strategies. So I ask, did military intervention as a primary tool for addressing international issues during Cold War impact American defense strategies in the long term? And my answer is yes. My thesis is the militarization of American foreign policy during the Cold War era has had an impact on US defense strategies. And during the Cold War era has also continued to influence American international relationships or relations. The US continues to position itself as a global police force, often prioritizing military alliances and security concerns over diplomacy. And as the first element of the final project, first critical element is the analysis of Cold War policy. And the Cold War, as you know, spans over several decades. So there are a lot of policies that are important, I believe, to review, given the different environments in each decade, each year, and really the different environments that each of our Cold War presidents were presented with during these times and deciding on these policies. So we start with President Truman, and the first key phase, as I see as these policies go, is this phase of containment of communism. And this era between late 1940s and 1950s, a lot is going on. In particular, in 1945, there is a lot going on. I probably could have wrote a final project just on the year 1945 with everything that's going on. But this background is so important in understanding the first of these key phases related to American Cold War era policies. So containment. Containment. So let's take a step back. With President Truman, he stepped into office after the untimely passing of FDR. And at that time, the focus was on the Pacific Theater. So he comes in post FDR, post Pearl Harbor, post the Yalta conferences, in which the goal was to obtain alliances in the Pacific Theater as well. And he's coming into this era of post World War II and now has stepped into the office as president and has made the decision to drop the nuclear bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which also led to presidential authority as the person authorized to order the use of nuclear weapons. And Truman was the only one who has so far. So, post World War II, again, focusing on Western Europe, there's a lot going on. Western Europe's in disarray. They need support financially, economically, militarily, and they're very vulnerable to this. And back at this time, the belief is that they're very vulnerable to the spread of communism. So, this idea of containing communism and supporting Western Europe is very important during this era. So we see military and economic assistance to the Greek government in its civil war against Greek Communist Party. We see assistance for Turkey, which is important later when we have the Jupiter missiles placed in Turkey under the Kennedy presidency. And an overall continued military assistance to Western Europe, again, with the belief that it's vulnerable and there's this fear that communism from the Eastern Bloc will spread to the Western Bloc. Um, in parallel, we have a deteriorating relationship between Soviet Union and Iran, which sort of fuels these tensions of American-Soviet tensions. And towards the end of Truman's presidency, we get to the signing of the NSC 68, signed in 1950, which now involves America in the Korean War. So containment, articulated by George Kennan, was aimed to prevent the spread of communism beyond where it already existed. And this defensive strategy, which was followed by the Truman Document, the Marshall Plan, and the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, was later viewed as an offensive strategy and seen as leading to unnecessary military engagements without a clear objective. Moving on into the next phase of Cold War policies, we are in the 1950s and 60s. And so this is sort of described as this peace and retaliation phase under President Eisenhower. And Eisenhower is a military guy. He actually visits Korea during his election campaign. And so when he is elected to be president, that's one of his main goals, his priorities is to get US troops out of Korea. He says small attacks on small hills would not end this this war in 1952. So after that, he really does focus on peace. He has the Camp Davis talks, which focus on peace, with then leader Nikita Khrushchev at the Camp Davis, again, with the idea that, they will ease the relations between the Soviet Union and America. However, the relations became tense after the Soviet Union shot down an American UT spy plane canvassing Soviet territory in 1960. So after this, American-Soviet relations intensified. And it wasn't until after that, like I said, it intensified. So then we move on into this idea of brinkmanship and really pushing, war to the edge of conflict with these different countries, and the beginning of covert operations and CIA-backed coups, like we saw or learned in happened in Iran in 1953, in Guatemala in 1954. And it was not until 2013 that the CIA admitted its involvement in the 53 coup against Iran's elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. We see the same release of documents related to Guatemala, with the CIA's first covert operation in Latin America was called Operation Success, coincidentally, which scholars say barely succeeded, and that the CIA scrambled to convince the White House that it was unqualified and all but bloodless victory. As we move through time in the next phase of Cold War policy, we get to Kennedy's strategy of flexible military strategies and President Nixon's strategy of détente. So in the 60s, as I mentioned, we're supporting Turkey. It's actually, we learn later in our historical works and released declassified documents that it was actually America who put the Jupiter missiles in Turkey first, and many scholars believe that that's what prompted the Soviet Union to place missiles in Cuba. So then we get faced with this missing Cuban missile crisis, excuse me, and also this the horrific conflict of the Bay of Pigs, where many American lives were lost. So, JFK at the time was seen as, this as being able to find a resolution, not merely just a triumph of brinkmanship, but it was a testament to the importance of diplomatic flexibility in his conversations and trying to ease the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, later scholars such as Max Hastings asserts that the resolution of the crisis was more due to luck and last-minute diplomacy than sound strategic judgment. Also, we learned later declassified documents, we learn about Operation Northwood and Operation Mongoose, which both in their own way aim to sway Americans and Cubans into supporting the war with misinformation and mispropaganda. Moving on to Nixon and the détente. So this is where we see a relaxing of the tensions with the Soviet Union through diplomacy and arms control. Nixon opens relations with China, taking advantage of the Sino-Soviet split as well in 1972. And in order to gain leverage in Cold War diplomacy. Nixon also pursued a Vietnamization, reducing US ground forces and shifting the burden of the war to South Vietnam as well. In our next key phase of Cold War policies, we see President Ronald Reagan in an aggression era and President George H.W. Bush under cooperation. Not to omit LBJ during his presidency, but I'm just focusing again on the policies that are related directly to the Cold War analysis section. So under Reagan's presidency, we see this new strategy of aggression. We see increased spending. We see the Strategic Defense Initiative implemented, and the US also supporting anti-communist insurgencies around the world, most notably in Afghanistan, where it armed Mujahideen fighters against the Soviet-backed Afghan government. And then, of course, we have the Berlin Wall, and where Reagan, the famous, tear down this wall. Well, what happened? Nothing. The wall did not come down that day, that month. History now shows us that it took a long time for that wall to come down. But then that brings us to President Bush, George H.W. Bush's presidency, where the wall's coming down, and now he's working through cooperation. So Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. He also, he pursued cooperation with the Soviet leader now, who's Mikhail Gorbachev at this point. But he managed to balance the militarized approach with effective diplomacy, helping to navigate the collapse of the Soviet Union without exacerbating tensions significantly. So in connecting these policies and understanding, we've touched on a little bit of the scholarly work that has been done at that time and to date. Well, I'll touch on that more, of course, but it's important to draw, the connections between the Cold War policies and sort of the social and economic and political themes. So what we have here is we're looking at first with containment. We go from a defensive versus defensive strategy, which for many, it's a conflated peripheral interest leading to unnecessary military engagements without a clear objective. And moving on to peace and retaliation. So, of course, we have the US nuclear arsenal as a deterrent and sought to reduce conventional military spending. However, this is one perspective, but later we get to a new perspectives where it's believed that these strategies actually fostered instability and anti-American sentiment in regions affected by CIA interventions, notably Iran and Guatemala. Going back to the Reds, to containment domestically, the Red Scare and McCarthyism fueled anti-communist sentiment, leading to widespread paranoia, civil rights abuses, and suppression of political dissent. So the change from offensive to defensive perspective on containment demonstrates a perception that containment strategies led, again, to unnecessary military engagements without clear objectives. Fast forwarding through our nuclear era, we get to the flexible military strategies. And, that whole scenario where some people commended Kennedy's flexible response strategy and military expansion for effectively addressing Soviet threats. Later when we learn about with declassified documents, we learn about the Jupiter missiles. We learn about really, the commotion of went on behind the scenes and the talks behind the scenes. And so people begin to criticize Kennedy's reliance on military solutions and the consequence of his decision, particularly regarding Vietnam and Cuba. During the 70s and détente, the strategic shift towards empowering allies rather than direct military intervention was one perspective, but extensive military escalations, particularly in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, were also present. So strategic calculations that intended to manage Cold War tensions and the ethical ramifications of military engagements are things that society started to think about, and like questions about are these really necessary? Is our involvement in these different countries and these different conflicts necessary? In regards to aggression, so late 1980s, 90s, connecting the relationship there. So military buildup was essential. Many people believe military buildup was essential in countering Soviet aggression and restoring American power. However, this approach also hindered on diplomatic resolutions and escalated tensions. Even during the fall of the Berlin Wall, for example, the United States, according to historian Mary Surratt, the United States claimed single-handed authorship of this event. So, and there's an American sense that somehow we brought down the wall and that we can do it again. But this, of course, was unfortunately pronounced after 9/11, according to Mary Surratt, when one started hearing the saying from Berlin to Baghdad. Um, Towards the end of the Cold War and establishment of the New World Order, there's a precedent for utilizing military force in the absence of direct security threat, contributing to the resurgence of geopolitical tensions and conflicts that define current international relations. Um, and I would say towards the end of these phases of policy during the Cold War and the connections of warfare to society, that at the end, the US really is seen as emerging as a world sole superpower. So what are the global repercussions for that? There we go. Well, there are definitely some. So in my in my research, I find we start with the idea of empire and what that means. And so historian Brian Mabee says the use of empire or imperial, especially to describe contemporary US foreign policies, have become commonplace. So while traditional perspectives will deny that the US is an empire, revisionists will argue that the US has engaged in imperialistic behaviors. And we start to see this change with like post-revisionists and new left theories. But it is something that I believe, based on my research, that imperialistic behavior does exist. And historian John Darwin argues that since World War II, the US had established an imperial military strength, echoing the British historical experience, where empire was often acquired haphazardly rather than through planned conquest. During the Cold War, the US acted as an imperialistic power, and by exerting economic, political, and military influence over other nations to contain communism and expand its global dominance. This was also seen through covert operations and military interventions, such as Vietnam and Latin America, and support for authoritarian regimes. The US sought to protect its interests under, I believe, the guise of promoting democracy. So imperialistic behavior, in my opinion. And let me go back. There we go. And just to kind of add to this and look at this at a glance, this is a map of the countries with proxy battles during the Cold War era. So of course we have the United States in blue, we have the Soviet Union in light red, and then in dark red is where we see the countries with proxy battles have taken place. And the end of the Cold War and establishment of a new world order and is a precedent for utilizing military force in the absence of direct security threat, contributed to the resurgence of geopolitical tensions and conflicts that define international relations. And this trend reflects a shift in US foreign policy from direct colonial control to more nuanced form of interventionism, where alliances such as NATO, economic aid, military presence are used to shape political landscape of foreign nations. Um, I believe this has allowed the US to secure influence without direct occupation as well. The use of militarized approach to foreign policy entrenched global power imbalances, contributing to decades of regional instability and fostering resistance movements. And so we can see here on this map across the globe, like how that has really impacted international relations for the United States. So is America an empire? Well, let's look at some more facts. So we see, again, based on the analysis of the policies, based on the connections and looking at the trends and the shifts from the mid 1940s to the early 1990s, and also taking in the perspectives of the scholars' perceptions during those times and over time, we do see a lot of interventions. And so the US coming out as a global superpower is often referred to as a global police force because of the involvement around the world. US military involvement in approximately 469 foreign interventions since 1798, but including 251 since the end of the Cold War in 1991. There's a theme about kinetic diplomacy. So this is the tendency to opt for military arrangements rather than pursuing diplomatic solutions first. And this is something that is also being considered as a new perspective when we're thinking about the idea of America as a superpower and America as an empire and imperialistic natures. Deployments such as special operation forces, which often occur without accompanying diplomatic engagements, reduce the role of traditional diplomacy in addressing global issues. So this is another example of a shift in how the militarization of American foreign policy has set this long-term repercussion post-Cold War. And then there's also a transition towards a force-first strategy, which has influenced societal attitudes, foreign affairs, increased reliance on covert military operations, and has reshaped the roles of diplomats and intelligence agencies. And also through this course, I've talked a lot about soft power and how there's been a lot of American influence and Western influence without direct occupation. And we'll see that in Germany. We see that after the formation of the Warsaw Pact. So there's a lot of evidence here that kind of supports this idea of an empire. And then further information regarding this. So the Cold War's emphasis on containment and military deterrence led to the institutionalization of defense spending in the US economy. This created a permanent military industrial complex that continues to influence economic and political priorities today. I think with the exception of Eisenhower, you do see an increased spending and this focus on this military industrial complex. So America's participation in the Cold War significantly shifted the relationship between warfare and society, extending beyond traditional military arrangements, engagements to influence cultural, technological, and economic realms. We see this, for example, in the space race against the Soviet Union and how quickly we advanced in technology and with NASA as we race, we all race to get to the moon. During the Cold War, the US acted as an imperialistic power by exerting economic, political, and military influence over other nations to contain communism and expand its global dominance. We see, and the Korean War is a perfect example of that. And so now we get to the global south, where there's just been decades of regional instability and fostering resistance movements. And I feel like, and I touch on this on my underdeveloped areas, but the global south, I think, is something that's often overlooked in scholarly work. So during the Cold War, the US also engaged in numerous imperialistic interventions in the global south, driven by the desire to contain the spread of communism and protect its geopolitical and economic interests. And some argue that US leaders increasingly used military force to achieve political objectives unrelated to traditional security concerns. And so this is often framed as a broader strategy of the Truman Doctrine and the policy of containment. But within the global South, the US supported authoritarian regimes and military factions in countries like Chile and Argentina. The CIA and US military were frequently involved in covert operations, coup support, and direct military aid to prop up these regimes, sacrificing democratic values for strategic gains. And it echoes of this Cold War era interventionism persist, particularly in US foreign policy in the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa. So more on global repercussions. So one of the starting with NATO in 1949, this was really instrumental in solidifying military coalitions among Western nations. Um, Many believe as the repercussions and in response to NATO that the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. But one of the most significant examples of establishing military alliances was the establishment of NATO, I believe, in 1949. It was created as a collective defense agreement in response to the threat of posed by the Soviet Union. And it was instrumental, as I mentioned, in solidifying the military coalitions among Western nations. But again, like I said, many believe that in response, that the Warsaw Pact was then formed by the Soviet Union, and it's pretty evident, the timing, so it makes sense. In the post-Cold War era, U.S. policymakers believed that the unipolar moment after the Soviet collapse provided an opportunity to transform other nations through interventions in places like Somalia, Bosnia, Haiti, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Um, I think, but in contemporary times, this militarization continues to influence US foreign policy, especially manifesting in defense spending and military interventions as primary tools as statecraft. The war in Afghanistan, the US aimed to shut down Al Qaeda in the wake of September 11th. However, the resurgence of the Taliban testified to the failure of the government to provide security. The Cold War also emphasis on containment and military deterrence led to the institutionalization of defense spending in the US economy, creating a permanent military industrial complex that continues to influence economic and political priorities today. And so, like I said, with the exception of Eisenhower, we see this gradual increase in military spending, especially through the Ronald Reagan era and Bush. Cold War militarization fostered a culture of fear and suspicion with the US, fueling domestic movements such as McCarthyism, while also justifying repressive measures abroad under the guise of combating communism. These left long-lasting scars in regions like Latin America and South Asia, where this anti-American rhetoric starts to grow, for going back to that idea that America sees itself as the global police and is intervening in conflicts where are today most people feel are unnecessary. And I think that this is also evident in regards to competing interests with Russia and China as well. And we see that even now with what some refer to our involvement in Ukraine. So moving to, again, the global repercussions. The US has often been characterized as a global policeman, intervening in the affairs of other countries to maintain international order, combat terrorism, and promote democratic governance. I believe that, based on our map of our proxy wars and the continued militarization of policy and more increased use of covert operations. And even going back to the beginning where Truman, gave himself the authority as president to be the only one to be allowed to call on nuclear arms. And that's still the case to this day. These all kind of support this intervening of affairs internationally, with the idea behind it of promoting democratic governance. Assessment and interpretations of existing existing interpretations. So existing scholarly arguments of the militarization of American foreign policy often focus heavily on the geopolitical and economic aspects of Cold War defense strategies. Historian Odd Arne Westad asserts that the ideological and military interventions by both the US and the Soviet Union in Asia, um, and the Soviet Union in Asia, Africa, and Latin America were driven by a combination of ideological enthusiasm and geopolitical strategy, which influenced the post-colonial states and reshaped global political dynamics. Historian Craig Campbell argues that multi-power politics has led the US to heavily rely on military power as the primary means of achieving its foreign policy objectives. The US continues to prioritize strategic alliances over the promotion of democracy when it serves national interests. And I think based on my assessment of different interpretations, this is evident in its relationships with authoritarian governments in countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt. The alliance primarily centered on mutual interest in oil and security, but has evolved into the focus on counterterrorism and regional stability, reflecting a blend of historical Cold War strategies and contemporary priorities. And historians like Mark Hass, who read Ideologies in US-Saudi Arabia Relations, he contends with that. Now, this assessment of different interpretations, again, this is definitely not all of the amazing scholars that I've researched and whose works I've read and studied, but this is just a handful of them. I could, of course, not fit them all on here, but just wanted to point out, we have a mix here of historians who've provided different scholarly works over time. So interpretations have changed, and schools of thoughts vary, from Orthodox historians, traditionals to revisionists, post-revisionists, and new leftists and new diplomatic history. But just starting with like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who we studied, an Orthodox historian, he viewed the Cold War as primarily driven by Soviet ambitions for world domination. In regard to containment policy, he argued that the US had little choice but to counteract Soviet aggression by adopting the policy justified by the moral obligation of defending democracy, of course. And traditional and Orthodox historians, such as Schlesinger, Herbert Face, Lewis Hale, they interpret Cold War policies as necessary in the aftermath of World War II and believe that all nations shared a common interest in all affairs of the world. The antithesis to the Orthodox view, revisionism, argues that militarization of American foreign policy was not a passive reaction to Soviet hostility. For revisionist historians such as William Appleman Williams, which we studied in this course, this was quite controversial for the post-World War II era. Later, the viewpoints on American foreign policies began to evolve, including New Left movements, as I mentioned, post-revisionist perspectives, and pro-Cold War revisionist folks like historian John Lewis Gaddis, who accepted the existence of an American empire, although contend it was primarily a defensive empire erected by invitation and not by corrosion. And that's his quote as well. I can also add that Andrew Bosovich argues that American society and its political system have become increasingly militarized, with a deep-rooted inclination toward the use of military force as a tool of foreign policy. He argues that the end of the Cold War did not bring about any reduction in military engagements, but rather we saw the US seeking new missions for its armed forces, leading to interventions in the Middle East and elsewhere. Melvin P. Loeffler argues that the Cold War era defense policies were greatly influenced by the perception of the Soviet Union as a major threat, despite its military vulnerabilities. He focuses on the connection between geopolitical, economic, and ideological factors that shaped US foreign policy during this period. Uh, Craig and Lovegaw argue that the militarization of foreign policy led to a cycle of escalation in an arms race that had long-term repercussions on both the US and domestic and foreign policy. Richard Immerman and Peter Goetz argue that American policymakers, influenced by a pervasive fear of communist expansion, prioritized military solutions as well over diplomatic or economic ones. And so this led to an entrenched defense establishment of the normalization of military prevention as a tool of foreign policy. Max Hastings, who I mentioned earlier, argues that in regards to the Cuban Missile Crisis, argues that the world narrowly avoided nuclear annihilation and that neither JFK or Khrushchev fully grasped the consequences of their actions. And then, of course, we have a historian, Matlock, who also critiques the lingering effects of militarization on U.S. foreign policy, noting how the Cold War era doctrines shaped future interventions and defense strategies, often prioritizing, again, military solutions over diplomacy and global affairs. And historian, last but not least, historian Mary Surratt refers to what political scientists call a powder keg model. In which basically means in order to understand revolutionary change, she says, you need to understand the long-term causes as well as the shorter-term causes or the catalysts. So I really enjoyed reading her arguments as well, and how she highlights the diplomatic decisions made after the Cold War, particularly also regarding NATO, where she says it set the stage for future geopolitical strife between Russia and the West. So kudos to all these amazing historians, regardless of their differing perspectives. I really enjoyed reading about all of those. And then in my assessment of existing interpretations in underdeveloped areas, so I think accessing comprehensive sources relating to social and cultural ramifications of Cold War policies it does present a challenge, but it is definitely an area that I think is underdeveloped. Critical cultural documents may be less preserved or available than political records, so it makes it difficult for historians to construct a robust narrative of the cultural impact. Also, educational environments and libraries often prioritize political science materials, which further diminish the visibility of social and cultural studies. But I feel like we have been seeing a slight shift in regards to the availability of those types of those documents and those information. And I think that's one thing I really liked about Mary Surratt, in her work and research and really trying to reach those social narratives. Post-revisionist historians, let me go back, have sought to synthesize various perspectives and emphasize the importance of examining culture and social context. So alongside political narratives, but the arguments are still in the minority. The broader academic work often lags behind new understandings, perpetuating the trend of underplaying social and cultural ramifications. And so I think it's important that if we do get a chance to address these social and cultural ramifications as it relates to American foreign militarization of American foreign policy, I think it would give us a more nuanced understanding of the impact, not just in America, but globally. And then original scholarship, current contributions and importance of scholarship. So I just wanted to, in this section, point out three particular historians. So we have Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man. And it outlines the success of democracy and free market capitalism as a dominant ideology that would proliferate throughout the world after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the representative death of communism as a viable ideological position. In John Mearsheimer's book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, he provides an overview of an international system from a structural realist also, or neo-realist perspective, specifically offensive realism. So in contrast to early classical realists like Hans Morgenthau, Mearsheimer argues that the structure of the international system is a cause of war, not necessarily moral concerns or the particular characteristics of a given leader. And his core predictions circulate around the changing dynamics in geopolitics as related to great powers. So Mearsheimer argues that conflict is a fact of the international system because ultimately the dynamics of great power politics lead to wars over dominance of the system. All three of these, and including Samuel Huntington, offer distinct perspectives on militarization of American foreign policy during the Cold War and its impact. Fukuyama is known for his thesis in which he argues that the Cold War's ideological conflict is rooted in military power. And it gave way to liberal democracy's triumph, reducing the need for heavy militarization in the post-Cold War. However, there are some challenges to this view, of course, that persist with the resurgence of authoritarianism. In Mearsheimer's argument, he contends again that military power was essential in maintaining balance during the Cold War, and that the U.S. continues to rely on military strength to secure its interests in a global system. Samuel P. Huntington, his thesis in A Clash of Civilizations suggests that post-Cold War conflicts would be driven by less military blocs and more by cultural and civilizational differences. Through militarization, though militarization remains relevant in addressing these tensions. So collectively, these scholars to me highlight how militarization has shaped U.S. foreign policy, though they differ on different their different arguments. It's still a good current necessity and idea of global context on the arguments that they're presenting. And it's also important that we understand that over time, if any, now in the 21st century, of course, what has changed since then or since the last time they've have done their work. And just to wrap up, so original historical scholarship, current contributions and importance of scholarship. So I do believe that there could be more research could be expanded by exploring the underexamined perspectives, such as the socio-political impacts of these policies on the global South. I've mentioned, much of the traditional Cold War narrative centers on the geopolitical rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union, and often sidelining the consequences for nations in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. These regions were not passive battlegrounds. They experienced significant political, economic, and social upheavals due to superpower interventions, proxy wars, and ideological impositions. Investigating these overlooked dimensions of the global South can provide a more comprehensive understanding, I believe, of how Cold War policies shaped global power dynamics and how they fueled conflicts and influenced post-colonial development, which continue to affect international relations today. And as a final note, for related to future research, the lasting effects of U.S. defense strategies should also include the response to the current war in Ukraine. As I mentioned, during the Cold War, the U.S. prioritized building strong alliances, maintaining military readiness, and countering Soviet expansion through proxy wars and military aid. So these strategies have influenced America's approach to supporting Ukraine as the U.S. provides military assistance and leverages NATO partnerships to counter Russian aggression. So in one of the questions that Professor Millich asked, throughout this term is, okay, we understand this, so why? Like, why is this important? And this, to me, answers the question as to why it's important, because The Cold War's emphasis on containing adversarial powers without direct confrontation, I think, informs the current strategy of supplying arms in places and intelligence in places like Ukraine, while avoiding direct military involvement to prevent escalation with a nuclear armed Russia. So this longstanding focus on alliance building, proxy warfare, and military deterrence shapes the US's modern defense stance in this conflict. And with that, that does bring me to the end of my presentation. I really appreciate your time you took to watch and listen, and I am looking forward to your feedback.